Declaro abierta la reunión número...
I call to order the meeting number 2090 of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This afternoon we're going to be having an informal meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women with representatives of non-governmental organizations. As you know, during each session, the committee invites to an informal public meeting non-government organizations at national and international levels to provide specific information on the states parties that are scheduled for consideration by the committee. So this is the first opportunity for NGOs to provide information on those states parties whose reports are being considered this week. Namely, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Saudi Arabia, and New Zealand. Next Monday, the 14th of October, at the same time, from 3 p.m. until 5 p.m., there will be a second meeting with NGOs and national human rights institutions. During this meeting, they will be invited to provide country-specific information on each of the states parties whose reports will be considered during the second and third weeks of the session, namely Chile, Canada, Japan, Cuba, and Benin. I would like to remind the meeting participants that this meeting is being live webcast on UN Web TV. I'm pleased to note that NGOs are taking advantage of this opportunity to provide information to the committee. This information assists the committee in its consideration of reports that are submitted by states parties. We would like to particularly express our gratitude and welcome the representatives of NGOs and the representatives of women in all of these countries. I'd like to particularly welcome all of those individuals who are with us online. Please bear in mind that unauthorized filming, recording, and dissemination of audiovisual materials during the 89th session is prohibited. NGO representatives have the right to unhindered access to and to communicate with the committee and its members for the effective implementation of the committee's mandate. Individuals or groups of individuals facing intimidation or reprisals for seeking to cooperate or cooperating with the committee or its representatives can inform the rapporteur on reprisals and alternate rapporteur on reprisals appointed by the committee of any alleged incident of intimidation or reprisals. Such complaints should be sent electronically to the CEDAW Secretariat. In order to ensure that all NGOs will be able to take the floor, I would urge all speakers to respect the time limits allocated for each intervention. I would now like to give the floor to my assistant so that she can give the floor to the different organizations who have requested it. Sorry, you have the floor.
Insana Vupasavana from the Association for the Development of Women and Legal Education for 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. On behalf of NICSO in Laopedia, I would like to address two issues following with two recommendations as below. The first issue is gender-based violence. A percentage of women and girls experience gender-based violence is high. Village authorities have misconceptions about what violence against women is. Women who experience violence prefer to tell their family, 34%, relatives 27%, village mediation limit 17%. We recommend to the government to develop appropriate platform to raise awareness for village mediation units and expand shelter service to ensure women and girls access to protection and legal mechanism. The second issue is access to justice. There are limitations to women's access to justice systems, especially in the context of violence against women. The survivors of violence against women generally regard this as private matter. The large proportion of village mediation unit is not trained on gender-based violence or legal assistance. Some village mediation units apply customary law to mediate violence against women cases without the presence of women representatives. The trust in justice system is quite low. We recommend to the Lao government to enhance the capacity of law enforcement officials and village mediation unit, review relevant laws for ensuring the full protection of women and girls, including conducting awareness raising campaigns in the community. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Manivan Suyabong from the Gender Development Association.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Committee. I am representing 9 CSO in Lao PDR to deliver our statement as follows. The government has national action plan to promote women's and girls to access health, education, market competition, and income-generating activities. However, issues remain concerning. The sexual and reproductive health of young people of age 15 to 19 giving birth, 83%, 1 per 1,000. Compare the differences ratio between the city and rural without a road to reach to. The maternity women use 1 of 3 teen give birth a midwife without medical experience. Therefore, 23.5% of girls 15 to 19 are married or in relationship, and 19% women aged 20 to 24 experienced childbirth before age of 18 years. We recommend the government to develop communications tools and diverse for ethnic women and who are illiterate about health information, provide community hospitals with human resources, necessary medical equipment. Dissemination the relevant information and law about the risk to health of women and girls who married at early age. To adopt multi-sectoral approach to prevent child marriage and ensure the effectiveness law enforcement. The literacy level so young male from age 15 to 24 is 85% is literate compared to women is the same age is 78%. The 42% young female at age 15 to 17 didn't go to school, and more than 1 in 20 never attended school, and 1 of 5 has dropped out. The reason is financial difficulty, supporting from parents, infrastructure and facility. To enhance monitoring and data collecting system of students who do not complete school and develop education system that motivates students to attend school and ensure job opportunity for them. Thank you.
Dr. Bunthon Chantalabon Viese, the Alliance for Democracy in Laos, for 2 minutes.
Madam Chair, the government of Lao PDR has announced in international forums that it would do everything to improve the human rights situation in Laos. But we observe that's the opposite in this case. Many laws that are supposed to guarantee human rights and women's rights only exist on paper and have not been implemented in reality. First item, the problem of human trafficking. Women and girls from Laos, some of whom are only 13 or 14 years old, are often offered to sell to men from China on internet. The arrests in this context were ineffective. The internet trade continues unabated, and the perpetrators are free again. Instead of the perpetrators, women rights activists and are arrested under the pretext of Decree number 117. This decree criminalizes any criticism of the state and its organizers. Women's rights activists and general human rights activists are persecuted, murdered, arrested, or even disappear completely under unclear circumstances. Another circumstance that severely restricts women's rights is the fact that citizens from China and Vietnam are guaranteed more rights than Laotian citizens. The investors, who now are over 50 of Laos land area hardly create any job for the local population with their projects. Land eviction and poverty are the consequences. This has enormous effect, especially on the female population. Lured by forced process, they often end up in forced prostitution or earth forced laborers or cheaper labor, both in the special economic zones of this investor and by dubious companies abroad. Thank you.
People's Organization in affiliation with its member, the Congress of World Hmong People, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Committee. The Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization and Congress of World Hmong People regrets that no information from our submission will be laid in those issues. In contrast, the systemic discrimination faced by the Hmong has been underlined by the UPR, 10 special rapporteurs, 2 UN Secretary General's reports and reprisals, and strongly communicated by treaty bodies CESCR and the CCPR. The Hmong are Laos's third largest ethnic group. In the Sai Sombong region, women and girls endure abject poverty, land grabbing, starvation, and a deprivation of essential services such as healthcare and education. International observers and aid have been denied access to the region for over 4 decades. The Hmong, especially those who flee to the jungle, are targets of extrajudicial killings. The UNPO possesses evidence of Lao government's multi-decade military campaign against Hmong civilians, using heavy artillery. Women and girls are strategically targeted when searching for food. Furthermore, women attempting to flee are subject to enforced disappearances and trafficking. Therefore, in addition to the state's report, paragraph 27, the prevention of trafficking must attend to the Hmong. Many Hmong women and girls have been forcibly relocated to state military-controlled villages and camps, where they're subjected to sex, slavery, or rape by law enforcement and military personnel. They are subjected to family separation and uninhabitable living conditions. Therefore, in addition to the state's report, paragraph 10, Lao must address gender-based violence against the Hmong. We strongly request that the committee raise our concerns. Contrary to the state's report's paragraph 73, the convention is not implemented equally for women and girls from ethnic groups. I thank you.
Dr. Joshua Cooper from Hawaii Center for Human Rights Research and Action, and on behalf of the Advocates for Human Rights, the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and Harm Reduction International, for 2 minutes.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
A culture of fear, corruption, and reprisals run rampant in Laos instead of basic human rights. People stand up for their ancestral lands, and when one speaks up for their sacred space, they are met with gross and systemic human rights violations. To live the values of CEDAW, one is instantly criminalized. Land grabs must immediately cease, and land title must be granted and guaranteed. Women are often left to deal with the aftermath and advocacy regarding human and indigenous rights defenders. Through the widely practiced decades-long enforced disappearances policies, women face greater oppression while standing up for those that have been disappeared. 2 examples is Tubi Li Fong, whose daughter is still only hoping for the return of her family's bones to conduct a proper cultural burial. And we call for immediate cooperation to return those bones to allow that to happen. Another, of course, is Sombat Sompon, where his wife Shu Ming continues to match his bravery daily, yet there are no results of the situation or circumstances. And the economy in Laos is a disastrous state. And this is due to rampant corruption in all levels of administration and failure to implement the human rights principles. One example is the recent dam disaster of 2018, where the people who stood up to ask for basic assistance were then put into prison, and unfortunately 50% of the land area now is owned by foreign investors, most of them from other countries. And on the issue of death penalty, women in Laos face greater gender-based and intersectional discrimination in the legal process, leading to the death penalty, primarily for drug-related offenses. These cases violate international law, which limits the death penalty to the most serious crimes. Women often receive unfair trials with mandatory death sentences, preventing consideration of mitigating factors and lack of qualified legal representation under fundamental and undermines our justice. Thank you very much. There should be a moratorium. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the 5 organizations who have contributed to providing information about the situation of women and the implementation of the convention in the Lao People's Democratic Republic. Let's turn now to the 5 organizations from Saudi Arabia who we have with us in the room. Sarah, please.
Dana Ahmed Al-Faran from Amnesty International for 2 minutes.
Honorable members of the committee, Madam Chair, Amnesty International welcomes the opportunity to engage with the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women ahead of the review of Saudi Arabia. We acknowledge some positive reforms to the male guardianship system since Saudi Arabia's last review. However, various other aspects of the male guardianship system were codified in newly enacted legislation, and the authorities have pursued a ruthless crackdown on women human rights defenders. In March 2019, women's rights activists were tried for charges that include promoting women's rights and calling for the end of the male guardianship system. While all of them have now been released after being subjected to torture, unfair trials, and imprisonment, some are now facing travel bans. In the past 2 years, Saudi women who have written on social media in support of women's rights have been sentenced to decades-long in prison. In one case, a 30-year-old fitness instructor and women's rights advocate was sentenced to 11 years in prison in a secret hearing before the Counter-Terror Court. Lastly, Amnesty International's analysis of the Family Law, or Personal Status Code, which entered into force in June 2022, and the leaked draft of the Penal Code, which has not yet been adopted, show that newly enacted and debated legislation entrench a system of gender-based discrimination in all aspects of family life, and do not adequately protect women from gender-based violence, including harassment, domestic violence, or marital rape. We call on the government of Saudi Arabia to amend the family law to ensure that provisions, including the remnants of the male guardianship system, are repealed, and immediately and unconditionally release all those imprisoned due to their women's rights activism. I thank you for your attention.
Lina Al-Adlul from MENA Rights Group and ALQST for 2 minutes.
My name is Lina Al-Hadlul. I am delivering the statement for MENA Rights Group and Al-Qist. It is with a heavy heart that I stand before you today. During the last review of Saudi Arabia in 2018, it was my sister, Lujain, who sat in this room actively working for a better future for women in Saudi Arabia. Upon her return to the Gulf, Lujain was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured for her activism. My family, too, was punished and placed under a travel ban. Though Lujain has been released, she remains under an illegal travel ban, her freedom incomplete. Unfortunately, her case is not isolated. Women human rights defenders are increasingly being subjected to arbitrary arrest for being vocal about women's rights issues. Saudi domestic law offers no protection for freedom of expression. Instead, the authorities use the counterterrorism and cybercrime laws to target anyone who raises independent opinions, including on the rights and freedoms of women in the country. Once arrested, women human rights defenders are subjected to a prolonged period of arbitrary detention and torture. They are often placed in secret detention centers and are denied contact with their families for months and sometimes even for years. Legal reforms introduced by the government in the past few years may represent steps in the right direction, but they do not go far enough, particularly without the active participation of women's rights defenders in the process. In fact, the reforms that have been introduced do not comply with the requirements of the CEDAW. Most importantly, the male guardianship system is still in force, as developed in our shadow report for this session. I urge this committee to encourage Saudi Arabia to honor its commitments under CEDAW and ensure that women's rights defenders are not only protected, but included in shaping the future of our society. Without their involvement, no reform will be meaningful and no freedom will be fully realized. Thank you.
Melin Svarsberg, the Advocates for Human Rights, the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights for 2 minutes.
The European Saudi Organization for Human Rights, the Advocate for Human Rights, and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, I thank the committee for this opportunity to address the issue of discrimination against women in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the application of the death penalty. Between January 2020 and July 2021, 2024, at least 11 women were executed mainly for drug-related cases, despite international standards limiting the death penalty for the more serious crimes. All of these women were migrant women from marginalized backgrounds and lacked access to a fair trial. For example, in March 2023, 2 migrant women, one from Nigeria and one from Pakistan, were executed for non-violent drug offences crime, despite one being a victim of human trafficking, a factor overlooked in her trial. Unfair trials, including the use of confession obtained under torture, have been reported, with several women convicted without legal counsel. Women like Isra Al-Gangoam, a Shia activist initially sentenced to death for peaceful activism, face added risk when challenging the state, especially if they come from marginalized communities. Gender-specific factors such as histories of abuse or trafficking are often ignored, and families are kept in the dark about execution, preventing them from advocating for their loved ones. We urge the committee to recommend that the government of Saudi Arabia ensure that women accused of crimes receive adequate legal representation that takes into account gender-specific concerns, including history of abuse, exploitation, and coercion, and that increase transparency in the judicial process by providing clear and timely information on women who are on death row and ensuring their families are kept informed, and vote in favor of the resolution of the moratorium on the death penalty that will be held in December 2024. Thank you.
Abdul Asid Muhammad from Migrants' Rights and Global Detention Project for 2 minutes.
Opportunity to address some of the grave human rights abuses that the women migrants workers frequently suffer in Saudi Arabia, both at the place of work as well as during their immigration procedures. In particular, arbitrary immigration detention. Based on the evidence presented in our joint submission prepared by the MigrantRights.org and the Global Detention Project, we urge the committee to advance the 5 following recommendations. 1. That Saudi Arabia end all form of the administrative detention of the migrant women worker based on their immigration statute, including the de facto in so-called detention shelter operated by the private contractors, where there have been a repeated allegation of the abuse and treatments and poor condition. 2, that the country improve its transparency and accountability in its treatment of migrants, women, and family during their immigration procedures, and this should include publishing up-to-date list of all the set of detention center and disclose details of the contractors managing the women's shelter, including any successor of the company that have replaced the former company that by the name of Sakan. We have received numerous alarming reports about the treatment of women in this shelter, but accountability and management remain unclear. 3, that the country should end its applicant regime, which is unjustifiably criminalized women attempting to escape the exploitation, and this system led to a detention and further abuse, trapping vulnerable women in the cycle of exploitation without access to justice. 4th, the country should end the immigration detention and deportation of a woman who become pregnant at the place of work, and this woman should receive the same level of maternity care provided to the national woman, and not to be punished or expelled from the country because of their pregnancy. And lastly, that the country should fully incorporate the domestic workers into its labor law and ratify the ILO Convention 198 concerning the domestic workers' right, and this will provide a vital protection and reducing the risk of arbitrary detention and exploitation. I thank you.
Mary Mugo from Semanami, Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, Solidarity Center, is with Domestic Worker Alliance, Africa End Sexual Harassment Initiative for 2 minutes.
Based on the thank you, Madam Chair. Based on the testimonies of 20 brave Kenyan women, it is clear that migrant workers endure severe discrimination. They are often subjected to lower pay, denial of basic rights such as rest days, and forced to live in inhumane conditions, which greatly diminishes their dignity. Many are forced to work for long hours with no rest, and their passports and mobile phones are confiscated, restricting their freedom. Some are subjected to extreme abuse, including physical violence, starvation, and sexual harassment. The kafara system further traps these women as they cannot leave their employers without permission, and those who try to escape are often criminalized. Moreover, justice remains out of reach for most of these women. Language barriers and the lack of legal aid make it nearly impossible to report abuse or seek help. In most cases, victims are detained and deported without being screened for trafficking or abuse. This experience is shared by domestic workers from other countries, with one of Zimbabwean domestic workers employed by Saudi diplomat in South Africa, reporting sexual harassment and rape. The systemic exploitation of domestic workers in Saudi Arabia and its officials outside the country urgently require stronger intervention, accountability, protection for vulnerable women caught in the cycle of abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much again to the 5 speakers who have contributed on behalf of the civil society organizations from Saudi Arabia. Thank you for the valuable information that you've just shared with the CEDAW Committee. Let's turn now to the organizations representing and who are providing information on New Zealand.
Caroline Herewini from the Te Waitiaki Wahine Refuge, Homeless Women Coalition and Maori Women's Welfare League for 2.5 minutes.
Nā inga reo e rauranga tirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, ngā rōpū whakaruru hau o Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tēnā koutou, Madam Chair. I am speaking on behalf of Te Wharetiaki Wahine Refuge and the Homeless Coalition. We urge our government to honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi, to focus on gender equality. Too many of our women are unhoused, unnoticed and unsafe. Honour UNDRIP. Ensure Indigenous children's whakapapa genealogy links remain the primary factor in state care and in any foster placement. Now, on behalf of the Māori Women's Welfare League, Madam Chair, the New Zealand government is a serial perpetrator of colonial violence. The government is a dishonourable partner of the founding agreements co-signed by our ancestors. With a legacy of 184 years of capitalist greed, the government continues to seek full control over Māori. Māori women and girls are profiled as a minority group and are othered. The government is in breach of CEDAW and the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people, UNDRIP, that are equally relevant to us. The New Zealand government and United Nations systems are not broken. They are designed to keep us at the bottom of every social indicator because that works for those in power. Māori women and girls are in urgent need of a global Indigenous Women's Forum under the treaties and commissions of the UN, United Nations Women, CEDAW and CSW. Māori women and girls need the New Zealand government to resume working with iwi Māori to develop a national action plan to implement UNDRIP. You, the CEDAW Committee, have the power to recommend that the New Zealand government affirm its commitment to CEDAW and promote CEDAW. Ngā mihi nui, kia ora. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Rebecca Lelaulu from Pacifica, Pacific Allied Council of Women, inspires faith ideas concerning all.
Talofa lava, Malorosui for Madam Chair. I represent Pacifica, a national organisation of Pacific women of Aotearoa, New Zealand, who have travelled, settled and led families to actively participate in this land we also call home. Providing educational pathways that will enable us to fulfil futures that contribute to building homes and safe communities for our women, girls and families. Work that gives us autonomy and economic prosperity, and what we all require to live our best lives. This requires the Aotearoa New Zealand Government to endorse and facilitate Pacific women's leadership, knowledge and aspirations. O le tele o sulu e maua e whingota. Through collaboration, we can all live in abundance. Whawhitai lava, Madam Chair.
Shasha Ali from Shakti.
Chair, distinguished members of the committee, I speak on behalf of Shakti, a national immigrant women's group, on the status of migrant and refugee women of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern origins in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Firstly, the issue of forced marriage remains inadequately addressed despite previous CEDAW recommendations. Madam Chair, this is the fourth time we are bringing up this issue. We appreciate the attempts at legislation change, but these are not effective on the ground. Women on non-permanent resident visas still face immense barriers in accessing justice, healthcare, and social security. New forms of abuse are emerging. We see our women abandoned after arriving in New Zealand and women stalked to death. Religious abuse is unrecognized. We see abusers keeping women in limbo about their marital status in the name of religion, even when legally divorced. The Christchurch mosque attacks on March 15, 2019, also exposed years of ignored advocacy by Muslim women who had warned about the racialized discrimination they face in everyday life. Systemic racism and socio-economic disparities overtly impact migrant and refugee women. Even highly educated women are at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. We urge the committee to call for stronger protections and systemic reforms to improve outcomes for migrant and refugee women living in increasingly ethnically diverse New Zealand. Thank you.
Rosina Sterling from Pacific Women's Watch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We encourage the government to adhere to its commitments to establish online and physical stalking as a criminal act, strengthen protection against online harm or hate. Ridicule in political debate is becoming too personalised and common. The government must evaluate legal and court processes to ensure victims of gender and sexual violence are not inhibited from seeking and accessing justice. We encourage the Special Rapporteur to investigate these issues. As per the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child 2016 and CEDAW 2018 New Zealand reports, the government ought to establish an inquiry regarding the non-consented medical treatment and surgery on intersex persons and provide redress. Instigate effective processes to capture data on male, female, transgender and intersex persons and their sexual orientation that supports their health, employment and social equity. The Human Rights Act 1993 must protect intersex and transgender persons as it does for males and females. The centering of gender and gender identity further ostracises intersex persons in legal recognition. The government must structurally adjust the economic system that is leaving in ever greater numbers of women and their children in poverty. The social environment is not cohesive for marginalised communities due to stereotypes that promote falsehoods resulting in significant social discrimination and harm. For example, Māori have co-governance rights due to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, yet these have been misconstrued as though it is race favouritism. Falsehoods of intersex people are used in arguments between gender-critical and transgender activism, leaving intersex people in a state of indignity. The government needs to enforce equity policies, implement cultural and competency training, and grow leadership for all of our communities. Ngā mihi, Madam Chair.
Delvin Stewart from the National Council of Women.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I represent 16 NGOs under the banner of the National Council of Women. I'm going to speak on 3 issues. First, rural women. In rural areas, internet and mobile coverage continues to be unreliable, often unavailable and unaffordable. This limits access to education and health services and impacts outcomes for rural families. We urge government to invest in the reach and reliability of rural internet and mobile communications infrastructure. Second, in regards to women's health, inequities remain persistent with higher rates of illness and mental distress and lower life expectancy for disabled women, Māori, Pacific, rainbow, transgender, intersex people, migrants and refugees. The health system is in crisis, with the state failing to effectively address intersectional barriers to access and safety. The state is failing to capture the compounded forms of discrimination and marginalisation that women experience. We ask the state to address with urgency the lack of substantive equality in health access and outcomes, especially in reproductive, sexual, maternity and mental health. The third issue is the gendered nature of poverty and its drivers. Government action in these areas has lacked the transformational change required. We want the state to mandate measures to drive diverse representation in the leadership and governance of private sector organisations, to address the impacts that gender norms have on how women's work, including care work, is valued, to set a minimum level for pay and conditions that upholds human dignity and well-being, and to mandate the collection of pay gap data and action planning to close gaps in the private sector. Pay gaps for Māori and Pacific women sit stubbornly at around 20%. There is also a 36% gap in retirement savings between men and women. Finally, we urge the state to implement national machinery that ensures intersectional disaggregated data is systemically collected and used to inform policy. Ngā mihi nui. Te aroha, te whakapono, te rari e tātou tātou e.
En nombre del Comité CEDAW, quiero...
On behalf of the CEDAW Committee, I too would like to thank the NGOs that have provided information to the committee on the situation of women in New Zealand. I would now like to invite the experts, members of the committee, to ask their own questions to these NGO representatives. I give the floor to Ms. Hacker.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the organization that represent Muslim women and family law, what do you think the government of New Zealand should do to release women from religious marriages, as I understand from your comment, that are capturing them in a relationship, although under civil law they are already divorced, and what should be done to combat forced marriage? Thank you.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rhoda Reddock has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the NGOs. I would like to find out about issues related to national rights of nationality and citizenship. I heard of problems with migrant women. For example, are there situations of statelessness? Are there any challenges with children of bornings in New Zealand? In other words, are there any issues related to women and nationality and citizenship? Thank you.
Gracias, señora.
Thank you. Ms. Bandana Rana has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also thank the NGOs for their remarks. On Lao, one of you mentioned that there is this increasing and flourishing internet trade where young girls between 13 to 15
are being trafficked or sold to China. In some of the reports I have heard, I have seen that the government has made some efforts. I want to know if the government recognizes this as a grave problem. Are there any efforts, or is there nothing at all? Because you mentioned that everything is in paper and no implementation, so I want to know your views on that. On New Zealand, in addition to some of the violence that you have mentioned over here, I wanted to know your view on increasing family violence, which has increasing trend and is expected to increase even further because of the weak police response. May I have your reaction on that? Thank you.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you. Ms. Despoja, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are also directed to representatives from New Zealand. And I thank my colleague Bandanarana for raising the issue of violence against women. I just had a specific question around the comments about intersex issues, and I just wanted to know, given that the government has established an intersex clinical reference group, are there any positive recommendations or movements coming out as a consequence? I thank you also not only for your moving display and song, but I acknowledge your reference to sovereignty and not ceding sovereignty. I also would like to understand better the perception of the breaches of Waitangi and what the recently introduced legislation means for particularly Maori women and girls.
Gracias.
Thank you. Ms. Akia has the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank all the civil society organizations that have provided us with very important information. I'd like to address my question to New Zealand, the team from New Zealand. I'd like to inquire if there are any specific challenges under Article 10, which is education, that you face, especially what should the government be able to address in relation to improve education. Thank you.
Gracias. Señora Gishia, tiene la palabra.
Ms. Gishia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank all the NGOs. I have a question to the representatives of NGOs from Laos. The legislative framework of Laos has been quite established. However, there are some gaps in implementation. I would like to inquire, what are the main reasons for the lack of implementation? For example, is it lack of a promotion and awareness raising, or lack of actions from the government? Or is it because of a lack of coordination between different departments, including lack of law enforcement? Or it is because the general population are not willing to implement the law? Government departments related to women's affairs, have these departments been playing their role? These are my questions. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Ms. Haidar has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the NGOs. I would like to address my question to the NGOs who spoke about the situation in Saudi Arabia. I would like to understand a little bit better. We all seem to have the concern of the maintenance of guardianship. However, some information claims that there is a genuine change in the area of women can obtain driver's license, they can apply for their own passport, they can travel without needing the permission of the guardian and obtain family documents, and they are also now considered legal head of household, and they were given the right to live independently without male guardian consent and to serve in the military. Are these just progress on paper? Because I understand that some part of the guardianship system remains, in particular when it comes to Article 15 and 16 and family relations. But at least can you tell me more about the areas I have just listed as being part of the radical reforms that have happened recently? And then the second question, do you have any statistics about the number of women human rights defenders that are still in jail? Thank you.
Silva de Alvis.
I give the floor to Ms. De Silva de Alvis. With a microphone, please.
NGOs from New Zealand. This question is for our NGOs from New Zealand. As many of you know, the only way the indigenous people's stories can endure is by reclaiming your sovereignty and your power and your right over the data. Data sovereignty of the indigenous is the new sovereignty. So I want to learn a little more from you as to what would constitute data sovereignty, your language, your stories, your culture, your heritage, and how do you plan to seize this opportunity of creating new narratives through data sovereignty. The second is about a very important climate case that was decided recently by the Supreme Court of New Zealand, where an elder of the Northland tribes won the right to sue 7 of the country's biggest companies involved in extractive industry and over their alleged contributions to climate change. So this really sets a precedent, not only in New Zealand, but across the world. And so if there's any information that you would like to share with us, that would be great. Thank you.
Señor Safarov.
Mr. Safarov has the floor.
Thank you very much. My first question will be to Saudi Arabia NGOs representations, especially on trafficking. What is the main problems of the implementation, the legislation on the side, and the national action plans? What's the real mechanism, how it works, especially on this side, on the prevention of trafficking, organ selling as a forced labor? Is it consist on what, for example, during after the last report till these days, how it's transformed? And one more question to the Laos NGOs, especially on the health articles, accessible. We understand that there are problems of poverty in this country, where accessibility is not so to the health institutions, not so easy. What is the legal situation, especially on the health instruments? Is it fully non-paid, or is it changed in your legislation till this day? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to all experts for the questions that they've asked. Now, because of time constraints, let me return the floor to the NGOs so that you can provide some oral responses to the issues that have been raised by members. And please do remember that you have the opportunity to submit answers in writing within 24 hours after this meeting, or in the information sessions that are planned during lunchtimes. So do remember you have this option to reply to the experts' questions. In the first instance, let me give the floor for 5 minutes to the NGOs from Laos so that they can answer questions. 5 minutes, please. And it's up to you to decide who takes the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to answer about internet control in Laos. The government don't make any effective action against human trafficking, especially the girls and between 13 to 14 years old. Internet control is very hardly, but only for human rights activists, not for criminals. Internet control for criminals is not effective in Laos. And the arrest In this context, where ineffectively the internet trade continues unabated and the perpetrators are free again. This is problem with corruption in every level of administration in the Lao PDR. Second one, I would like answer about her system in Laos. The Lao people must pay for her system. The people are very poor. Around 80% of the Lao people are very poor now. Income is very low, around $70 per month. This is for the people, they have employees, but around 30% of young people do not have any employees. It's a problem to pay to her system in Laos. Thank you.
Entiendo que no hay ninguna.
My understanding is that there's no other organisation from Laos that wishes to take the floor. If that is correct, we can now give the floor for a further 5 minutes to the NGOs from Saudi Arabia, so that you too can answer questions asked about that country.
I'd like to address the question on the male guardianship system. Indeed, Saudi Arabia since 2018 has implemented reforms to its male guardianship system, including allowing women to apply for passports, be legal heads of households, and obtain family documents, including birth and death certificates. However, other aspects of the male guardianship system remain intact and codified in other laws in the country, such as the Personal Status Code or the Family Law. And this includes women having to obtain the permission of a male guardian to get married, still under the new Personal Status Code, as well as women being appointed as the child's custodian instead of the child's guardian. In the new Personal Status Code, only men who are the fathers of the child are automatically granted guardianship of the child, while women are considered custodians. So the male guardianship in that regard is still codified in these two aspects of family life. We can also follow up with the committee in writing for further answers about the implementation of the male guardianship system currently in Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Let me ask if there's any other NGO from Saudi Arabia that wishes to take the floor.
Por favor.
Please do go ahead.
To follow up on what my colleague said about the last question, there is also the disobedience law, meaning that a woman is still can be considered as disobedient to her male guardian, and we don't really know what that entails. So anything could be considered as disobedience, and a woman could be arrested for whatever the guardian considers as being disobedient, which sometimes also gives a veto to the new freedoms that are granted by the government. I would like to answer the second part of the question regarding statistics. Unfortunately, I mean, Saudi Arabia has really turned into a police state, meaning that institutions do not grant official documents, and it's very difficult to get official information. And more than that, speaking about imprisonment can be criminalized, so families are also very scared and fear speaking about a woman being in prison, so we do not have official statistics. We at Al-Qist, we're a grassroots Saudi NGO, we are monitoring at least dozens of cases of women being imprisoned for expressing their views on women's rights in Saudi Arabia. But again, it's only the tip of the iceberg, and without fair open trials and without access to independent monitors in the country, we cannot have exact numbers.
Por este aporte.
Thank you very much for that additional contribution in answer to the questions on Saudi Arabia. We can now give the floor to organisations from New Zealand. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I'd like to answer the question on education and culture in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I speak on behalf of our Pacifica women, our Pacific and Māori and other Indigenous communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The connection to language and culture boosts women's confidence in their personal, culture and professional capabilities, empowering us to navigate diverse environments. Our government must recognise the vital importance of our identity, which is deeply entwined with our language, culture and traditions. This recognition is not only essential for preserving our heritage, but also for empowering our women and our communities, ensuring representation and fostering a more inclusive and diverse society in Aotearoa. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Any other organisation from New Zealand wishes to speak?
Is it working? Yeah. Madam Chair and distinguished members of the committee, thank you so much for your questions on Muslim women and how the law has impacted the dissolution of marriages and what other recommendations we'd like to present, and the question on statelessness as well as violence against women. We will be preparing answers and endeavour to respond within 24 hours with some substantial documentation following the report that is already available, and explore discussion during our lunch session. Thank you.
Gracias. Siguiente.
Thank you. The next organisation, please. With a microphone, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the members of the committee. As far as the intersex question, the reference group has been set up and money has been distributed to some organisations to establish some medical guidelines, but that has only just started in the last 6 months, so we have no idea the end results of that at the moment. But those who have suffered in surgeries and treatments up till this period are still suffering, and so that even if that is successful, it won't help those who have already been through the system. Thank you.
Gracias. Siguiente organización.
Thank you. The next organisation, please.
Kia ora, Madam Chair. I'd like to answer the Māori sovereignty question and climate change. We take note, and we will, that's quite a complex issue. We will get back to you later. But I would like to comment on the breach of Te Tiriti sovereignty. Article 1 of Te Tiriti talks about kawanatanga, which is the right to govern by the Crown. However, Article 2 about tino rangatiratanga is about Māori retaining their sovereignty over their valued possessions, which includes not only our land, but our rights, our children, where our children's guardianship is, and over all that we value, over all taonga that we value.
Nuevamente, en nombre del...
Once again, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank all of the NGOs who are present here for the valuable information that you have shared with the committee. I'd also like to invite you, if convenient, to provide us with further information in writing within 24 hours, as we mentioned earlier, and during the respective private lunchtime briefings with respect to the consideration of the different states' parties. I would now like to adjourn this session. We will be pausing for a few minutes, so if you wish, you may remain here. We will continue the the meeting with the human rights organisations in NHRI. So we adjourn this session, and in 5 minutes we will begin the next session. Thank you.
Declaro.
I call to order the informal public meeting. That is, I call to order the informal public meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. Can I ask for silence, please? I was saying I call to order the informal public meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women with representatives of national human rights institutions. Could I kindly ask for quiet? We're going to continue with the committee's agenda. Quiet, please. So, I call to order the informal public meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women with representatives of national human rights institutions. I would now like to request that my assistant tells us which NHRIs we have with us in the room, please. Thank you.
La señora
Madam Saunomali Dr. Karanina Sumeo, Acting Chief Commissioner of the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. She is accompanied by Miss Brittany Peck, Legal Advisor. Ms. Sumeo, welcome. I'd like to give you the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Chair, committee members, excellencies, colleagues, and brothers and sisters from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Bonjour, tēnā koutou, talofalava, greetings. Thank you for this opportunity. The Human Rights Commission is Aotearoa, New Zealand's national human rights institution with A status accreditation. The first thing I would like to bring to the attention of the committee is the rights of our Indigenous women. Our Māori women in New Zealand are at serious risk due to a lack of constitutional protection and regressive policy and legislative measures. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or Te Tiriti, is New Zealand's founding constitutional document, affirms Māori women's Indigenous rights to sovereignty and self-determination. Yet, Māori women and girls continue to experience inequities across almost every well-being measure, including health, justice, state care, employment, income and housing. 67% of women in our prisons are Māori, but Māori only make up 20% of the general population. Despite this, our government is currently working through a reform program that looks to further undermine Māori women's rights. That includes disestablishing the body created to advance Māori health equity and self-determination, introducing a bill to reinterpret Te Tiriti principles to omit reference to Māori self-determination and their particular Indigenous rights, and reviewing the role of Waitangi Tribunal, the primary avenue for Māori to raise claims regarding Crown breaches of Te Tiriti and the entity which is currently undertaking a major inquiry into Māori women's rights. The government has already overridden Māori rights recognised by the tribunal and courts and stopped all work to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. We therefore urge the committee to recommend that the New Zealand government, number one, strengthen legal and constitutional protections of Te Tiriti, number two, take meaningful action to implement UNDRIP, and number three, ensure all law and policy reforms meet obligations under Te Tiriti and General Recommendation number 39. The second sphere of rights I'd like to bring to the attention of the committee is violence and abuse faced by women and girls. New Zealand, unfortunately, has one of the highest rates in the OECD of family and sexual violence, especially for Māori, Pacific, ethnic and disabled women. In 2022, and relevant to previous CEDAW recommendations, the government launched Te Aorere Kura, a national strategy and action plan to eliminate family violence and sexual violence. However, there has been a recent reduction in funding to prevent and respond to sexual and gender-based violence. The government also ended a safety-focused regulatory review of online services and platforms before completion, despite a rise in targeted attacks on women in public and private online. This year, the report from the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Historical Abuse in State Care and Faith-Based Care was released. It revealed the grave extent of physical, psychological and sexual abuse that took place, in some cases amounting to torture. Abuse included regular intrusive genital exams and, quote, health checks, end quote, providing cover for abuse. Unmarried and pregnant women and girls were detained and exploited. The government has committed to designing a new redress system, but survivors still have no immediate prospect of full redress, including compensation and rehabilitation. We therefore urge the committee to recommend to the New Zealand Government that, number one, they develop and implement an updated Te Aorere Kura action plan and mainstream gender-specific issues. Two, to resume the regulatory review of online services and platforms. And three, implement all the recommendations for the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care, noting specific references to CEDAW and human rights. Thirdly, I would like to highlight women's social economic security for the committee's attention. In 2019, the Welfare Expert Advisory Group made recommendations to restore dignity to the social security system. Recommendations on indexing income support to wages and removing sanctions were progressed, but have recently been reversed. This will disproportionately affect the incomes of women, particularly older, disabled, Māori and Pacific women. The social security system still does not allow people to retain their individual incomes if they are viewed to be in a relationship, quote, in the nature of marriage, end quote. This creates risks for women, including social isolation, financial entrapment, and difficulties leaving violent or abusive relationships. In 2018, the in-work poverty rates in New Zealand ranged between 9 and 12%. This figure would be higher today, with the rate being substantially higher if the main income earner is a woman. For the year 2022 to 2023, 1 in 8 children in New Zealand lives in poverty. Many are children of parents and caregivers in paid work. Gender and ethnic pay gaps persist, as I'm sure some of our colleagues here from New Zealand have already spoken of. In 2022, the Human Rights Commission undertook an inquiry which found that for every $1 a European male earned, in comparison, a European female earned 89 cents, a woman female earned 81 cents, and a Pacific female earned 75 cents. The gender retirement gap widens in every age group category throughout women's working lives, culminating at 26.9% in the last decade pre-retirement. The previous government announced its intention to introduce mandatory gender and ethnic pay gap reporting, but the current government has decided not to progress mandatory reporting. Instead, it will develop a voluntary tool. The focus is primarily on the gender pay gap. This decision willfully neglects evidence that racism, ableism, and violence and harassment affect pay, progression, income security over a lifetime, and preparation for a dignified life in retirement for women. We therefore urge the committee to recommend to the New Zealand Government, number one, adjust income support rates to those recommended by the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, adjusted for inflation. 2, individualise income support entitlements. 3, introduce appropriate temporary special measures to ensure equal opportunity by gender, ethnicity and disability. 4, introduce pay transparency legislation covering all size businesses and to eliminate pay inequity based on sex, ethnicity and disability. Number 5, amend the Equal Pay Act 1972 to include ethnicity, disability, gender and sex. And number 6, ratify ILO Convention 190 on Violence and Harassment Convention. Thank you very much, Committee, for the opportunity. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
En nombre del comité.
On behalf of the CEDAW Committee, I would like to thank the New Zealand Human Rights Commission for being here with us and for providing us with the information that you've shared. And now I would like to give the floor to the members of the committee if you wish to ask any questions or make comments about the statement that we've just heard. Thank you. Madam Hyder, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really can't resist when there is an NHRI in the room, but to ask a question, because it's very dear to my heart that you are present and you are sharing with us, in particular an NHRI like the one of New Zealand. I was just a little bit puzzled by the beginning of the statement, and you spoke about the potential setback on Indigenous women, because I remember the last dialogue was exactly the opposite. It was such a positive experience that if I'm allowed to, would like to understand what, in your view, is the reason behind this setback, just to be able to. Thank you very much.
Madam, for the question.
De los distintos expertos y seguidamente le.
We'll take questions from the different experts and then we'll come back to you with the floor. So I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Dotis Despoja.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In fact, my questions do follow on from my colleagues in relation to the perception and reality, question mark, of setbacks. You talked about the legislation that's been introduced to reinterpret the Waitangi Treaty. I'm just wondering if there are specific references within that legislative proposed framework that deal specifically with undermining or affecting in a negative way the rights of women and girls. We've noted that there's something like a 60% increase in reports of family violence, and I take note of your recommendations in relation to that particular issue, but if there is a suggestion that these rates are going to continue to increase, I'm just wondering if you've got any analysis around that, whether that's because of awareness raising and therefore people seeking support and help. We've also heard my colleague Ms. Bandanarana raise the issue of, I think referenced in one submission, the idea that police response time was particularly slow. And I'm just wondering if you wanted to elaborate further on the need for the government to incorporate or implement UNDRIP in relation to the rights of Indigenous persons within the not constitutional but legislative and policy frameworks of New Zealand. Thank you.
Tiene ahora la palabra.
Thank you, and I'd like to give the floor to Madam Boniface Alfonso. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a very specific question about the progress of the implementation of abortion and what is going on in rural areas. I've seen that there is over-regulation in terms of the issue of conscience, so these are my questions. Thank you.
Ahora sí. Ahora le damos la palabra a la señora Sumeo, representante.
I'd like to give the floor to Madam Sumeo, the representative of the New Zealand NHRI, to respond to the questions. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the experts and their questions. We will do our very best, and we also have information sheets and various documents that we'll send through that will help elaborate on some of the responses. Can I take? I'll take the questions relating to the treaty and UNDRIP and constitution. So New Zealand does not have a formal constitution, and it's one of our weak areas. Hence, the Treaty of Waitangi is not embedded as a core part of our law, and hence the vulnerabilities of the rights of our Indigenous people, the rights of women to their lands, to their resources, and so forth, aren't protected. Our own Bill of Rights does not include all the human rights in it. For example, it doesn't include social and economic rights, for example, the right to work, the right to health, the right to education. These are quite fundamental rights. So it's very limited. So we are very weak in that area. And therefore, if there is a piece of law that's going through that's going to, for example, weaken the rights of women, for example, to equal pay, it's really hard, to stand up and push against targeted policies like that are there. They're temporary measures that are there to ensure equality. We currently have an environment in New Zealand where temporary measures to ensure equality are seen as somehow discriminatory, and that links to the question around the sudden shift in sentiment. As Madam here said, last time when we came, we were very positive and upbeat about the progress. Well, since then we've had a change in governments who have a very different view and actually see targeted service, including in health and education, for, say, Māori and Pacific, as being discriminatory. So their idea of what's universal, they want universal rights, assuming we're all equal in the first place, and we're not. And we know that. So this is these are really important questions around the Constitution, because without those constitutional protections of fundamental rights, we will continue to slide. And as we gave an example before, We've talked about the new government removing the body that was set up to help address health inequities for Māori women. And that's a backward move. Certainly, if I can go to the area of social security, we've had an Equal Pay Act since 1972, and we're far away from having equal pay. And so it's nothing to be proud of. So in a way, the intention has been there, but we're moving back gradually and not gradually, very, very quickly in some of the fundamentals we've got. So we're looking at women going into homelessness, situations of homelessness. Cost of housing is very, very high. Access to health is not guaranteed anymore in New Zealand. If you've got the money, be lucky if you're still waiting 1 or 2 weeks, for an appointment. So we are going back rapidly, so it's quite significant. Let me just let Britt respond to the issue around justice, because we want to raise the issue of there's lots of changes going through the justice system, and the provision of cultural reports has now been removed. But Britt, can you talk about that, and that will now impact increasing the numbers of Māori women in prison? Yeah.
Thank you, committee. The question was around gender-based violence and possible increases in that area. One of the issues we're seeing at the moment is, whilst there are statements of things like this being addressed by the government, they're very shallow. They don't actually go to the root issues. And we see there as being a retrogression in government policy in this area, including reduction in funding to initiatives that would prevent and respond to sexual and gender-based violence. We've seen an intention from police to attend fewer family harm call-outs, and also there's been an ending of a review into a safety-focused regulatory review of online services before it had been completed. So there's lots of changes like this which have the effect of compounding the persisting high rates of violence in New Zealand, and our concern is at the moment that instead of progressing things are going backwards in that area. And because we already have these ingrained issues affected, that we expect that will continue. Sorry.
Now, can you hear me?
I'll try moving.
Yeah, I'll try that. Yeah, that one's green. Yeah.
Apologies, thank you. I think where I was at was that because there's been this retrogression, we expect that the existing disproportionate impact on Māori and Pacific women, disabled women, will be increased over that time. I can give you some statistics that there's been which I think the member was referring to, a 49% increase in family harm investigations recorded by police in the year to June 2023, and over 90% of sexual violence we still expect is not reported to police. Thank you.
I could just respond to the question around abortion services. We have a somewhat of a health workforce crisis in New Zealand, and availability of abortion services in rural areas is definitely a need. We have a gap there. So, thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. We have further requests for the floor. Madam Nikoti, you have the floor.
I would like to have some kind of more detailed information as far as temporary special measures are concerned. You mentioned that some DSMs are with discriminatory nature. Could you just bring a little bit more detailed information about that? Because we take temporary special measures like a good thing, but we understood that that could have negative side. The other side, which is not that nice as far as New Zealand is concerned. So could you give a little bit more detailed information on that? Thank you.
But the use, you asked about the use of...
Gracias. Antes de...
Thank you. Before I give you back the floor, to give the floor back to the NHRI for them to respond, I'd just like to ask whether any other members of the committee would like to join the second round of questions and ask a question. No? In that case, Madam Mayor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Just so I've understood the question, is it around the use of temporary measures? Yes, yes. So under the Human Rights Act, there's the ability for organisations to develop, measures to ensure equality. Unfortunately, those measures, especially in the area of health and education, are seen as somehow violating universal rights, and therefore seen as discriminatory in some parts of our country. So the ability to therefore address inequity has become even more difficult under the current climate. And if we take the issue of pay equity, there's ample evidence around the gender pay gap. There's also now ample evidence around the impact of racism on progression and income, and therefore contributing to the ethnic pay gap and discrimination based on disability. And there's some evidence of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender. We're unable to address those in a targeted way if there's a resistance to use temporary special measures, because it's seen as some sort of permanent thing that's going to be there forever. It's like the word temporary is really important to use, and that may be one way to mitigate the fear that somehow some people will miss out. But definitely it's allowed in our Human Rights, our Human Rights Act, to develop, temporary or develop measures to ensure equality. But there is definitely a resistance from some circles that by targeting certain groups that others will miss out. And we need to reshift, we need to change that frame. But it's very powerful at the moment. Hence, any temporary measures to help uplift the well-being of tangata whenua, our Māori women, will be seen as somehow then discriminatory to other women, despite the fact that the Treaty of Waitangi protects and upholds the Indigenous rights. So that's an example. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. So with that, we reach the end of the public informal session with the National Human Rights Institutions. Thank you very much once again to the New Zealand Human Rights Commission for being present today and for providing us with the information. So this meeting is adjourned. We will have a technical pause to move to an internal closed meeting of the committee. So we have a pause until 5:10 when the committee will move on to the next item of the agenda. Thank you.
Retomaremos.
We will resume at 5:10 as set out in the agenda, because the speaker of the next session is not available until that time. Thank you.